Why am I so afraid?
When will this pandemic end?
Are we ever going back to normal?
Why can't I give this up?
Why is our country so divided?
Why did she cheat on me?
Why is he so mean to me?
Why did they have to die?
Will the grieving ever end?
Why won't God answer my prayers?
Why is this happening to me?
Where is God in Afghanistan?
Where is God in America? Is God going to heal my mom?
How can any good come from this?
Haven't I been a good person?
Good morning to you. If you have your Bibles, open them to Genesis 37. And by the way, you sound good as a choir out there. That was beautiful, man. That was great worship. Thank you for the worship team for leading us and for you singing along and being a part of this. It's an opportunity for us to sing together. There's nothing like it when we come together and worship. I worship in my car. I sing these same songs in my car to myself. It's different when you're all in the same room. So it really is cool to hear all of your voices. Genesis 37, we're in part 2 of our series called God Has a Plan, How to Trust When All You See Is Trouble. And let me just speak a little bit of encouragement and gratitude, all the men whose wives are back from the women's retreat. If you ladies had a chance to go to the women's retreat, we missed you greatly. And glad you're back, and it's always a good eye-opening experience to do my wife's job for a week. It gives me a good reminder that I don't want her job. She can have it right back, and she does a great job and does it way better than I can. So it's good to have all of you here. I hope you had a great time on the retreat. If you were able to go, really excited and encouraged to hear all the great stories that came out of the retreat. This morning, as we go into this series, if you missed last week, part 1, we are talking about the life of Joseph. And there's 2 big Josephs in the Bible. There's the Joseph we're very familiar with because of the Christmas story, Joseph, the father of Jesus. We're not talking about him today. We're talking about Joseph in the Old Testament, the famous Joseph story, which we learned last week. Sometimes we use the word story, and it's an okay word. The problem is sometimes people think we're talking about a make-believe story or something that's made up or that isn't actually true. These Old Testament accounts we believe are true. These are actual people that walk through actual events that experience the work of an actual real God in their lives. So we take these stories to be literal. These are real people in these stories. So when we say the story of Joseph, we really mean the record or the account of Joseph's life. And it's interesting because the Old Testament, Genesis being the first book, Genesis is a pretty big book of the Bible, and 25% of it is dedicated to the life of Joseph, which tells us something. His life is significant. We need to pay attention to it. It's very important, but it never fails. Every time I launch into a series in the Old Testament, someone comes up with the same question. I got 2 or 3 this week, actually. Why do we still go to the Old Testament? Aren't we New Testament Christians? Don't we study? Isn't the New Testament more important? Didn't we replace the Old Testament with the New? I get questions like that all the time. So let me answer them to all of you. No, the New Testament does not replace the Old Testament. The New Testament is a description of the new covenant through Jesus Christ. And we understand the new covenant because of the old covenant or the Old Testament. That's what the word testament means, covenant. The old covenant, the old understanding of the people's relationship with God, we see that unfold through the Old Testament so that you can understand that God's work throughout history is that what he began essentially through Abraham, this plan of God to build a people of his own was being culminated ultimately through his son Jesus, who would come in the New Testament. So we don't kick out the Old Testament. It's part of our Bible for a reason. It's there on purpose so that we would look at it and learn from it. Whoa, we are losing lights. See, when I speak, things happen. See, this is dark. At least I did it right when my arm went like that. It went out. Okay, so I can do this in the dark. So if you have a Bible, I want you to take a moment, keep your finger in Genesis 37, but flip over to Romans chapter 15. It's a very important Bible verse to help us understand what we're looking at when we look at the Old Testament. Romans 15:4 says, this is the Apostle Paul, by the way, who is a New Testament writer. He is writing the book of Romans as we speak. As we're reading this, it's when he's writing it. So he says, for everything that was written in the past was written to teach us, so that through the endurance taught in the scriptures and the encouragement they provide, we might have hope. So Paul, who knows Jesus, who has an understanding of the new covenant, says the reason why we look back, everything written in the past, is so that we will learn. It'll teach us things so that through the endurance taught in the scriptures. What scriptures? What scriptures is Paul talking about? He's talking about the Old Testament scriptures. Sometimes you read the Bible, it's referred to as the law and the prophets, because there's the first 5 books of the Old Testament would represent the law, and then there's essentially the rest of the Bible. They would group up into this idea called the prophets, all the prophetic books. So that was the understanding of the Old Testament, was the law and the prophets. And so what Paul is talking about here is the scriptures provide lessons for us in endurance. Now I want you to understand that word. That's a very important word. Endurance is a key word in the Christian life. It's a key word when it comes to our faith, that we would understand that God's word teaches us about how to endure in our faith. And as you know, life has a way of making our lives hard. The circumstances of life get difficult, and we often put that blame back on God, and we want to give up on our faith. In fact, it's happening in record numbers right now in our culture, in our world. People who for a long time in their lives, maybe their entire lives, have essentially believed the Bible. They have believed in Jesus. They have a measure of faith in their lives. And now, for some reason, they're questioning it. The official term for this is called deconverting. They're deconverting from their faith. Some longtime Christians are saying, I don't believe that anymore. And you have to ask the question, well, what changed? The Bible didn't change. God himself didn't change. So what changed? Well, we know culture changes. What's popular or well accepted changes. People's opinions change. But God's word doesn't change. So I want to really encourage you, in this society we live in, this world we live in that is constantly against the things that we believe in the Bible, there's a massive movement trying to push you. There's the lights. If you're watching from home, you're missing out. But there's this movement in our culture trying to push you away and to question everything that is considered orthodox belief in the Bible, orthodox truth. And so we have to be mindful that the God who wrote the scriptures, who inspired these men to write these words, he knew that we would have these moments where we would question our faith, moments of doubt, moments of fear, moments of confusion. And so God equipped us and said, the reason why we study the Bible is so that we would learn from this idea of endurance. We would watch people trust in God over a lifetime. We would watch people cling to a promise God makes and hold on to it all the way until they died, never see the fulfillment of that promise, but they held on to the end. We hold on to promises like that as New Testament Christians, don't we? We hold on to the promise that Jesus said, one day I will come back for you. Some of you will hold on to that promise and you will die and never see him come back. You'll meet him in heaven, but you will not get to be a part of watching that moment because we don't know when he's coming back. But we hold on to those promises. And here, Paul is saying everything written in the past is to teach us so that we would learn from the endurance taught in the scriptures, so that we would be encouraged and that we would have hope. And don't we need hope? There's enough going on in our lives. We need some hope. And so I get encouragement from this when I think about this idea that life is not easy. Which brings me to another question. Why do we call things good and other things bad? Have you ever had that question? This is one of the main reasons why people defect on their faith, is they say, well, how can a good God let this bad thing happen? Now let me clear the air on good and bad. There is a such thing as a moral right and wrong. There are absolute truths. You can read about them in this book. There is a such thing as absolute truth. And I believe that, this church believes that, there is absolute truth. We don't get to pick our own truth, okay? That's not how it works. We agree with truth or we disagree with truth, but we don't negotiate with truth. Truth is what it is. And so when we think of right and wrong, there's a good and bad morally. God has a moral code for things that are right or wrong. Our choices, our behaviors, there's a such thing as right or wrong. However, right or wrong, good and bad, don't necessarily apply to circumstances. We go through circumstances that we say are bad. You've been through them. We've all been through bad circumstances. And certain circumstances that were bad, you lived through them, you got to the other side, and you looked up one day and you thought, wait a minute. With all that I've learned, all that I've come through, I'm not sure it was bad anymore. It felt bad. I thought it was bad, but somehow good came from it, and now I'm confused. Was it bad or is it good? See, that's a picture of God's work. Because God is the one that if we endure, if we hang in with him, a lot of the things we call bad, we start to learn from them, we grow from them. There's a good outcome that comes out of those. So then the thing that we once called bad, we change and we call it good. Which is why we have to be really careful when we start to blame God for bad things that are happening. Maybe those bad things aren't so bad. Maybe those bad things have a purpose. Which is right where we find Joseph in Genesis chapter 37. Let's pick up. Last week, we left off with Joseph, this young teenage kid, 17 years old. He's got big dreams for his life. He's an arrogant teenager. He thinks he's the stuff. He is the favored child, number 11 of 11 brothers, the favored son. He's hated by his brothers because he's the favorite. And then he has these dreams, 2 dreams. Both of them involve his brothers bowing down to them. Not good for family dynamics. So his brothers hate him. Genesis 37, verse 12. Now his brothers had gone to graze their father's flocks near Shechem. And Israel, that's the dad's name, that's Joseph's dad, that's his nickname, Israel. His real name is Jacob. Israel says to Joseph, as you know, your brothers are grazing the flocks near Shechem. Come, I'm going to send you to them. Very well, he replied. So he said to him, go and see if all is well with your brothers and with the flocks, and bring back word to me. Then he sent him off from the valley of Hebron. So what you notice in this passage is the favored son is not out working. He's at home with dad. And all the other brothers are out working, which only makes this hatred between brothers worse. These 10 older brothers are out slaving away for dad, and favored youngest brother is sitting at home. Lap of luxury, silver spoon, the whole deal. He's living the life. And then dad wants to go check on his son, so he sends the youngest to go check on him. He's a hall monitor. He's going to go and check and see if they're behaving out there. So he sends Joseph. Joseph goes out there, and it says, when Joseph arrived at Shechem, a man found him wandering around the fields and asked him, what are you looking for? He replied, I'm looking for my brothers. Can you tell me where they are grazing their flocks? They have moved on from here, the man answered. I heard them say, let's go to Dothan. So Joseph went after his brothers and found them near Dothan. So he's wandering around kind of aimless. He finds them, finds some direction, goes after him. Verse 18, but they saw him in the distance, his brothers did. And before he reached them, they plotted to kill him. Here comes that dreamer, they said to each other. Come now, let's kill him and throw him into one of these cisterns and say that a ferocious animal devoured him. Then we'll see what comes of his dreams. Wow. These are his brothers who are saying this. I don't know what kind of family you grew up in. I'm betting this was worse than your family life. As dysfunctional as yours probably was, this has got to be worse. They see their brother coming from a long way off, and they immediately jump to murder? Whoa, that's a leap. Except for, it's not a leap. It's not a leap, because something was going on inside these brothers for long enough that when it finally got to the boiling point, what comes out is murder. See, Jesus told us about this. He told us this would happen. Look in Matthew 12, real quick, verse 34. For the mouth speaks what the heart is full of. A good man brings good things out of the good stored up in him, and an evil man brings out evil things out of the evil stored up in him. So the question is, what were these brothers storing up in their heart? We know already. They were jealous of their brother Joseph. They hated him. They resented his place in the family. They resented that he was the favored brother and they were second best to him. They were burying all of that in their hearts. I had this guy tell me one time, he used this illustration. He took a tube of toothpaste and he squeezed it and toothpaste came out. And he said, why did toothpaste come out of this toothpaste tube? I said, because you squeezed it. He said, no, because toothpaste was inside the tube. See, his point was, the only reason toothpaste came out is because toothpaste was inside. He says, what you can't change is the fact that you'll get squeezed. Whatever's on the inside of you when you get squeezed is going to come out. And Jesus is teaching us about that here in Matthew 12, that whatever you store in your heart, it will eventually make it out of your mouth. It will make it into your life. And it will begin to have its impact on the people around you. So what you store up in your heart will make its way out for better or worse, for good or bad. And this is where these brothers were. They had so hated Joseph that they decided that they would murder him. So my question for you is, what are you storing up in your heart? See, this is a great snapshot of emotional dysfunction in a family. Emotional dysfunction among brothers, among men, where they're storing up all this anger and frustration and difficulty inside, and at this moment it all comes out and they want to now kill their brother. So my question for you is, what are you storing up on the inside of your life? Because it's eventually going to make its way out. And I'll give you some principles about emotional health here. One of those is this: your negative emotions will grow in secret and your positive emotions will shrink in secret. And it's actually the inverse when you apply it the other way. Your positive emotions will grow when they're shared, and your negative emotions will actually shrink when they're shared. So we have to understand from an emotional health standpoint how we deal with what goes on the inside. It's very serious, because the things that you face in life, you stuff them all down on the inside. And if you put that negativity on the inside, I will tell you what happens in secret in your heart. It grows. Jealousy turns to murder. That's what happens. But the positive stuff, you would think the positive stuff would grow if you put positive. No, the positive stuff shrinks inside your heart. Positive things need to be shared. We need to get this stuff out of our lives. That's how we process it. Which brings me to a very important point. Everybody needs a Bob. See, some of you know my friend Bob Williamson. Bob has played a key role in my life over the last several years. When I was going through one of the most emotionally difficult seasons of my life, Bob, being one of my best friends, he was that person I could go to and share my emotions with. We'd go on these long bike rides and he would just listen. I would talk and I would just sort of vomit at the mouth and share all my emotions. And he would always ask me some Bob question. Like, what are you going to do about that? I'm like, don't talk to me. I don't want to hear that. But he would hold me accountable to those things that I would say, and he would process those things out loud. And here's what I always would occur. If it was deeply negative, by the time it got out of my mouth, it started to shrink because it was exaggerated in my heart. But when I got it out, it started to make more sense and it would shrink. And then I would say, oh yeah, that's mine. I got to own that part. I got to own that part. I got to deal with that. And it shrunk the problem way down. The positive things that I was holding in my heart, if I would share those would expand. If I was grateful for a little bit grateful for something, I was a lot grateful for it once I shared it. It's amazing how that works in our lives. And so I just want to tell you, some of you need a Bob in your life. You need someone that you can depend on and share with and talk to. And let me say this, because this is not said enough in churches. Some of you might need to sit down with a professional counselor. I can't tell you how many times I've heard in the church people turn their nose up at that as if it's some lack of faith in God to go to a therapist or a counselor. These are people made by God, gifted by God in many cases, trained and equipped to help you process your emotions or your mental health. Go to them. I have paid really good money to people to help me process my emotions. I have gone to counselors. I've gone to a week-long intensive. It is important to deal with your emotions. And I'll tell you this, I'm still not there yet. It's still hard for me. And some of you needed to hear that today because you think, It's petty. This is silly. This is stupid. Let me tell you what petty and stupid turns into. It can grow into significant and serious really fast inside your heart. Jealousy can turn into murder. And so right here in this story of Joseph, we see this emotional processing that needs to happen. I wonder what would have happened if Joseph's brothers had Bob. If they would have just been able to sit down with Bob and go on a long bike ride and just share with him how frustrated they were at their father Jacob, who was a favoritism father who was taking care of one and not the rest. Or maybe they would share with Bob their frustrations about their brother's dreams and how hurtful it sounded to hear that they would bow down to him one day. And maybe they felt overlooked because they're in the middle of a pack full of children and they never seem to get any attention. If they could just talk to someone about that, I wonder if jealousy would have grown into murder. And here, these men, they're not boys, they're men, they're grown men. They're all older than 17, because that was Joseph's age. These are grown men about to murder their brother. And before we leave this subject, don't think you're above this. Every one of us is capable of any sin you have ever heard about or read about. What we store up in our hearts will eventually come out of our lives. We have to be so careful. Verse 21. When Reuben heard this, he tried to rescue his little brother, Joseph, from their hands. Let's not take his life, he said. Don't shed any blood. Throw him into the cistern here in the wilderness, but don't lay a hand on him. Reuben said this to rescue him from them and take him back to his father. So Reuben, let me tell you about Reuben. Reuben is the firstborn of all these boys, all these men. He's acting like a pure firstborn. He is over-responsible. He's trying to convince them to do the right thing. He's managing his own father's emotions. He's trying to control this whole situation. So he tries to talk them down. Look, don't kill him. Throw him in the big hole. We'll leave him in the wilderness, thinking in his mind, I'll come back and get him later. I'll save him, bring him back home. We'll sort this out when we get back with Dad. Like a typical firstborn. Some of you have been there, right? You feel the need to manage your entire family, right? Manage everything around you. That's Reuben. He's trying to figure it out. So when Joseph came to his brothers, they stripped him of his robe, the ornate robe he was wearing, and they took him and threw him in the cistern. The cistern was empty. There was no water in it. So they found this dry hole in the ground and throw him in there. See, Reuben's learning a lesson here about the rest of his brothers. A vital lesson in life. You can't reason with unreasonable people. And you cannot negotiate with anger. Which, I said this in the first hour, I don't want to turn this into a marriage talk, but when you're angry with each other, that's why you don't get anywhere. Sometimes you just got to let the anger settle so that you can have a meaningful conversation to move forward. When you try to talk when you're angry and you think, why aren't they listening to me? It's because you can't negotiate with anger. Anger clouds your judgment. Anger shuts off all good communication. And you can't think straight, and you don't talk straight, and you don't get anywhere together. And Reuben runs into this with his brothers. So they throw him in the hole. As they sit down to eat their meal, verse 25, they look up and saw a caravan of Ishmaelites coming from Gilead. Their camels were loaded with spices, balm, and myrrh, and they were on their way to take them down to Egypt. Judah, one of the middle brothers, says to his brothers, what will we gain if we kill our brother and cover up his blood? He wasn't talked out of killing him yet. He was just down there in the hole. Verse 27, come, let's sell him to the Ishmaelites and not lay our hands on him. After all, he is our brother, our own flesh and blood. His brothers agreed. So when the Midianite merchants came by, his brothers pulled Joseph up out of the cistern and sold him for 20 shekels of silver to the Ishmaelites who took him to Egypt. What I think is really amazing to me is that these 10 brothers can throw their little brother into a hole and sit down and have lunch. That's how hard of heart these men had become. That's how calloused they were. They were like, just put him in the hole. We'll kill him later after lunch. We do our killing after lunch. You know, that's what they're thinking, you know. And then Judah notices this caravan of merchants coming by, and he's like, ooh, and now I got an idea. You know, he was successful somewhere in life. He was trying to figure out how to make money. He was like, I know what we can do. We can sell him. We'll sell him to these merchants. We'll actually make some money today. Now, let me tell you, This sounds like it's better than murder, but there are things that are worse than murder, one of which is called human trafficking. They traffic their youngest brother and sell him into slavery to these merchants for 20 shekels of silver. They reduced his value as a human being to 20 shekels of silver. This is hate like you've never seen. They hate him. So they sell him. The worst betrayal in verse 29. When Reuben returned, Reuben had stepped away for a moment, firstborn. When Reuben returned to the cistern and saw that Joseph was not there, he tore his clothes. He went back to his brothers and said, "The boy isn't there. Where can I turn now?" Reuben had a plan, and they did not agree with his plan. He thought he had agreement, but he realized you can't negotiate with angry people. They sell him into slavery, and Reuben is like, "Oh no, my plan. What am I going to tell Dad now?" He's not concerned about Joseph. He's concerned about his dad. He's concerned about being the firstborn. What's this going to look like for me? All this. Because I've always wondered, why doesn't Reuben hop on the fastest camel he can find and go chase him down? Because he doesn't care about Joseph. He cares about himself. He cares about his reputation. He cares about what his dad will think. Because all of these 10 boys are trying for one thing. Who can finally get the attention they deserve from Dad? So they come up with a new plan. Verse 31, then they got Joseph's robe, the coat of many colors. They slaughtered a goat, dipped the robe in the blood. They took the ornate robe back to their father and said, "We found this. Examine it to see whether it's your son's robe." He recognized it and said, "It is my son's robe. Some ferocious animal has devoured him. Joseph surely has been torn to pieces." Then Jacob tore his clothes, put on sackcloth, and mourned for his son many days. All his sons and daughters came out to comfort him, but he refused to be comforted. "No," he said, "I will continue to mourn until I join my son in the grave." So his father wept for him. So they came up with another plan. We'll fake his death. We'll dip his coat in blood. We'll take it back to Dad. And right on cue, Jacob, the father, he fills in the blanks. Obviously, a ferocious animal killed my son. And they just agreed, "Yeah, you're right, Dad. That's what happened." And he starts mourning the loss of his son. I've known a handful of people who have lost children like that, either through an accident or just an untimely death. And whether it was timely or untimely, you don't get over that. I don't pretend to understand the grief that a parent would feel after the loss of a child. I pray to God I never have to face that. So you can only imagine the grief that this father is going through. And it doesn't make it right that Joseph was his favorite, but it makes this grief worse for this father. So he's deeply grieving. So these brothers have gotten rid of their annoying little brother, but they also lost a part of their dad on this same day. And you would think this is a great place to just close the curtain and call this the scene, and let's remember the grief of a father, and let's not make bad choices like that because we cause harm to others. But there's one more verse in this chapter. In verse 36, I love this word, meanwhile. Now, if you're a Bible underliner, I want to encourage you to underline or circle that word, meanwhile. It's the word that reminds us that when you think everything's over, when you think all that can be lost has been lost and there's no way to recover and there's no more future here and there's no more hope, there's this word, meanwhile. Meanwhile, God's at work. Meanwhile, God's watching over this whole thing. Meanwhile, God has never left his throne. He has never given up control. God is the God of meanwhile. Meanwhile, the Midianites sold Joseph in Egypt to Potiphar, one of Pharaoh's officials, the captain of the guard. Why is this verse so important? Because it's like God wanted us to see that the story of Joseph isn't over. His life isn't over. His brothers thought it was over. His dad for sure thought it was over. But God is watching over Joseph. And I'm sure, to some degree, Joseph thought his life was over. He's been sold into slavery. He's lost all of his privileges as the favored child in this wealthy man's home. He has nothing. His pedigree means nothing. His background means nothing. He is a piece of property as far as everyone around him is concerned. He is thousands of miles from home. Undoubtedly scared out of his mind, fearful, total dread, hopelessness, darkness, every bad thing you can think of. And that reminds us of our Hebrew word last week. Does everybody remember taking Hebrew class last week when you were here? We taught you a word, hasab. Now we're going to do this together. I want you to all say it. Hasab. Very good. We're going to do it one more time. Hasab. You got to get your guttural kind of throat thing. You got to get just hasab. Okay, that's the word that means plan or intention. When we say God has a plan, this is the word in the ancient Hebrew. That means God has an intention in all of these things. God is orchestrating the details. And yes, when we go through moments like this that Joseph is facing, where it seems all is lost, there's no more hope, this is total darkness, God still has chasab. He still has his plan. So that your valley experience becomes a canvas for God's work. He's orchestrating the details. He's working on things in your life. He is always working to take what you perceive initially as bad to something that is good. And we know the end of the story. We know where this goes. There's still several chapters left in Genesis. The story, the life, the account of Joseph is not over. God is working it out. And so, as God works in the valley, his plan will always, at least, there's more, but it will always bring three things into your life. I really want you to write these down. Freedom, growth, and mission. This is what God is doing. This is his plan when we go through the valley. The first is freedom. As awful as the circumstances were, these circumstances, being sold into slavery, is what lifted Joseph out of the toxic family he grew up in. Finally freed him from the hate of his brothers. Finally lifted him out of all the jealousy and rage around him. See, and that's what God will do with you. You're in these circumstances and you feel like they're so awful. I'm just going to let you know, God is orchestrating a particular freedom in your life. And it is probably from someone or something that is toxic in your life. And you can't let it go. You can't get out on your own because you feel too connected to it. You feel too emotionally tied to it, too invested in it, too unable to see past it. You feel stuck. You feel like this is all I've got. This is all my life will ever be. Your vision is clouded. You have no way out of it. You're just in it. You're just stuck. And you know what God has to do? He has to blow your life up to break your grip off of that. That toxic thing that you hate, you don't even like it, but you're trapped in it. And so God, in his grace, orchestrates some circumstance that just rips you out of it. And it hurts, and it's painful. You feel grief like you've lost a loved one, but you will look up one day and you will go, thank God I am free from that. He will bring you freedom. Number two, he will bring growth into your life. This new life that Joseph was entering into, not by his choice, not something he wanted, never would he have selected this option, but he is thrown into this new life that's going to require him to grow up. No more claiming I'm the favorite, no more sleeping in on Saturdays when everyone else is working. He has to grow up. It doesn't matter what he's done in the past. He's got to grow up. He has to decide, and this is the decision you will face. You have to decide to grow or to be a victim, but you don't get to have both. The most normal thing for any person in Joseph's shoes would be to say, oh, woe is me, I am a terrible victim of these circumstances. And just to go internal and just collapse under all that pressure. Or you can decide, no, I'm going to grow. I'm going to grow up. I'm going to, in Joseph's case, I'm going to let these circumstances knock the arrogance off me. I'm going to let these circumstances teach me how to trust in God. I am not going to give up. I'm going to endure. Remember that word, endurance? I'm going to endure. I'm not going to be a victim. I'm going to look at these circumstances and I'm going to ask God, what are you trying to teach me? What lessons do I need to learn? Some of you, you feel like you're in a perpetual valley, like you can never seem to move forward. I say this with all respect and compassion for valleys. But some of you need to ask the question, what growth am I resisting? What growth are you resisting? Because that may be the key to moving forward, is because I truly believe this. God loves you too much to leave you the way you are. And I believe God will say, hey, that's fine. If you want to camp out right here, we can camp out. But I'm going to teach you this lesson. God loves you that much. So we have to decide to grow. We have that opportunity to grow. And some of you, you need to ask the question, what part of my past do I need to let go of? And what part of my life do I need to take responsibility for? And will I accept my current reality? Some of you, we all know people who do this. Let me just give you a little tip, especially just to the men here. Man, if you've ever been in a conversation with some other buddies and you refer to back in the day, you're old, okay? That's an indicator that you've now become old. Guys, like when we work out together, we say things like that. Well, back in the day, I could lift this much. Let me tell you how much that means. 0. That means nothing. Right? That's in the past. Question is, what about today? Right? But we get hung up on the past, don't we? Some of us, it's not about how much we could lift, right? Your bench press from high school, nobody cares, by the way. How many touchdowns you got when you were the captain of the football team? Nobody cares. Right? How successful you were at your last job? Nobody cares. How much money you made on that deal back then? Doesn't matter. The good old days, they don't matter. Sure, those are great experiences, those are good memories, but sometimes those things become anchors and you keep from growing because you're so connected to that and you define yourself by those things. You know what's really sad? Defining yourself by some job you had 10 years ago. That is sad. Defining yourself by some point of success in the past rather than where you are today. And I know you might not like where you are today, so it's more fun to talk about the past. But this is where you have to grow up. Growing up says, what part of my life right now do I need to take ownership of? Where am I responsible for what's going on in my life? And take responsibility for that. And then what part of your life do you just have to accept, this is my life now? And that's hard, guys. I have been there. And it is painful. It feels like a death, having to let go of that. It's hard because when you've defined yourself one way for so long, it's very hard to let that go because you worry, will I ever have anything that defines me or makes me successful or significant in some way? That's what the valley's for. Makes you grow. Helps you move forward. And in Joseph's life, we don't see number 3 yet, but we will see it. Number 3 is mission. The valley will give you a mission. The valley is what teaches you what's really important in life. That growth piece that we talked about, you also get a whole new set of values, things that are now important to you that weren't important before. And that's what fuels your mission, that suddenly you start to care about things you didn't care about in the past. God has done an incredible work in my life. I feel like every time I think about my ministry now, I do a lot of the same things I did before, but it's like I'm wearing a new set of lenses when I look at ministry now. I care about things differently than I did before. Because even though I loved helping people and I loved ministry, I'll tell you, my own personal agenda was all twisted up in it. I wanted to be an author and speaker and travel and be semi-famous and all that stuff. I was just going to tell you, I don't care about that anymore. And I know there are people out there doing that and they're great and that's awesome. That's not what I aspire to anymore. What I really love is when one of you comes to me and says, man, I'm really struggling. And I have to keep myself from smiling because I know you're hurting, but I'm kind of excited for you. I'm like, this is good for you to go through a struggle because you're going to grow. You're going to find freedom that you've never found before. And then God's going to change your heart to the degree that you will be on a mission. And I firmly believe this. When you experience God taking you through a valley, you become a valley person. You become someone who loves to help people in the valley. We're going to see this unfold in Joseph's life. Way at the end of the story, Joseph, in all of his new success, in all of his restoration, he turns and helps others. It's this amazing transformation that happens in his life. This kid that was once arrogant and selfish and all about his own self and his own dreams and all his own ideas, he becomes this man who helps others. See, this is what God wants to do in you. He wants to make you a person that cares more about others than yourself. And it's a lifelong journey. We'll never fully get there. That's the struggle of carrying sin around with us. But God puts us on a journey to get there. And we start to care about others. And God changes us. You know, I've been studying this life story of Joseph, and I thought after reading this week, I thought, you know what? It's so similar to the story of Jesus. You know, Jesus, at the end of his life, was standing around with his friends, and one of his best friends shows up to betray him for 30 pieces of silver. Remember that, Judas? He sold Jesus for 30 pieces of silver, reduced his life to the value of 30 pieces of silver. Very similar to what we read here about Joseph. And then what unfolds is something we all know. Jesus gets arrested, goes through this mock trial, ends up getting sentenced to being crucified, and he dies on a hill called Golgotha. But then I started going, wait a minute. Jesus and Joseph are nothing like each other. Similar components, but completely different. Joseph had no control. Joseph got sold into slavery and carted off. He had no control over that. Jesus, however, had complete control. In fact, he tells us this in the New Testament. Nobody takes my life from me. I lay it down for you willingly. That's the God we serve. A God who certainly understands the valley, but a God who absolutely understood his mission. His mission was to seek and save the lost. Nobody took anything from Jesus. And the worst day in human history has now become the most celebrated day in human history. We call it Easter. Celebrating the resurrection of Jesus after his awful torture and death. Why do we celebrate it that way? Because God has a plan. And that plan was for our good and for his glory. This is the God we serve. So we're going to do something this morning. As a way to respond to this message, we're going to sing a song. It's a new song. It's called God Really Loves Us. I heard this song and I told Jacob, I said, we've got to sing this song. And I want this to be your prayer. Some of you are struggling right now with whether God loves you because of what you're going through. And it's easy in these circumstances that are negative and hurtful. It feels like God doesn't love you. And so you start to wonder, will he love me? And maybe you feel like one of these brothers of Joseph's. You think, well, he probably loves me. He just doesn't love me as much as some people. You look around and you think, well, they must be like Joseph. God loves them more than he loves me. And maybe today you need to be reminded that God really does love you. And whatever you're going through, he has a plan. And one day, if you endure, one day, you will look back and you will say, thank God for the freedom, for the growth, and for the great mission he has set you out to be on. His mission. This is what he's done for us. And so whether you feel it or not, let this song be your prayer. Sometimes we have to talk ourselves into some feelings. If you don't feel it, sing it anyway. Let's endure in our faith in the God who really loves us.